Wars, as we talked about earlier, don't often solve old problems. They often create new ones, and this gets us to our C for consequences as opposed to our C for causes. When the war begins, Lincoln has no intention of freeing slaves. Lincoln's position was slavery. Personally, he did not agree with it, did not like it, thought it was bad, but did not think it was his job as president to impose his view of morality on everyone else. Instead, Lincoln said, I'm only here to prevent slavery from going into the territories. Slavery can stay where it is, and my primary goal as chief executive is to preserve the Union. Part of Lincoln's talents, though, and his greatness as a president, was his ability to change with the times as the times necessitated those changes. Originally, he starts out, and this is a war being fought exclusively for national union, having nothing to do with slavery. And Lincoln says, I'll do whatever needs to be done to preserve the Union. If that means freeing slaves, I'll do it. It means keeping slavery, I'll do it. If it means freeing some and keeping others, I'll do that too. Ultimately, two things merge. His own personal view that slavery was bad merges with his view that as chief executive and president, preserving the Union calls for him to do what needs to be done, and freeing slaves winds up being what he needs to do. Initially, Union troops confiscated slaves, who were called contrabands, and kept them on their side so they couldn't aid the Southern war effort. Over time, after Antietam, Lincoln takes the position after 1862, August, to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, saying on January 1st, 1863, all slaves in areas of rebellion will now be free. Now, think about the legalistic nature of what I said. Your teacher should have talked about it. Lincoln says all areas that are now in rebellion, their slaves are going to be free in 1863. Well, that's great, but these areas in rebellion don't recognize the federal government as their authority. It's not like they're going to do that. In the 4 states, the border states that stayed with the Union, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, Lincoln could free slaves. He could have done it, and he didn't. So the knock on him is where he could free them, he didn't, and where he had no power or authority at all to free them, he did. This tells you something. Lincoln's motive here was not necessarily legalistic or civil rights. His motive was political and diplomatic. By issuing that proclamation, he was sending a signal. He was sending a signal to England and France, the great European powers, that the United States was ultimately going to abolish slavery, knowing full well that by doing so, he would be able to keep them probably out of this war because their populations had already outlawed slavery in their governments, and they wouldn't have stood for their own governments of France and England siding with a confederacy that still had slavery. Now, from England and France's point of view of their governments, there's real benefits to be had if the Union loses the Civil War. It makes this country weaker, it divides it, it maybe gives England a chance to work back down in the Oregon country, gives France a chance to extend their influence to Mexico and to Texas, maybe some of these areas here, and it cripples a rival in the New World to both of those powers. So their governments, realpolitik, saw interests and reasons to want to maybe see the South win. But in a pragmatic sense, they couldn't side with the Union in that instance. Or they couldn't side with the South, rather, if the Union was going to free slaves in the long view. And Lincoln waited until after a victory, so he had the high moral ground, so it didn't look like an act of desperation. Now, notice the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. In these states, slavery was legal, and it stayed legal throughout the war. Lincoln's position was that as a reward for staying in the Union, he wasn't going to trifle with their social institutions, not yet. And besides, if slavery goes away here, ultimately it's going to probably be a dead letter there. Lincoln's major priority and goal was to keep the border states in the Union. He joked that, I'd like to have God on my side, but I've got to have Kentucky. He thought that not having Kentucky having this confederacy of a border on the Ohio River might make them so strong and diverse economically as to limit their North's ability to truly win this contest. So by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, the war does change. And the war changes from a conflict over states' rights into a conflict of human liberation to set other men and women free. Another unanticipated consequence, black troops. In the beginning of this war, it was largely a white man's fight and African Americans were excluded. By the time the war ends, particularly after the Emancipation Proclamation, tens of thousands of African Americans joined the United States Army. And in the last month of the war, the Confederacy was so desperate that they too offered slaves freedom in exchange for fighting for the Confederacy. Not all Southerners approved of this. Alexander Stephens, their vice president, said, if we do this and it works, if we make slaves into soldiers and slaves turn out to be good soldiers, then everything that we've based our system on has been a lie. The whole notion of white supremacy. And he wasn't prepared to face that. He said, we cannot do this. They did it anyway, but within a month, it was a month towards the end of the war, a couple months remaining, so it did not tip the scales and made no difference. The infantry charge becomes obsolete, which is a lesson that will be relearned on the battlefields of World War I in 1914. Weapons technology has made this frontal assault far too bloody and cost ineffective to actually pull off in a victorious manner. And you have the emergence of what we talked about already of total war. Sherman's march to the sea and the Union mobilization of the entire economy for the war effort begins to get into this notion of what we think 20th century wars are, that civilians are sort of soldiers without guns. Civilians contribute to a war effort on the home front, and they're participants and victims. Women, changing labor patterns, women women engaged in more work on the home front economically. Women certainly engaged in assisting the armies on both sides. And it was a boon a real option for women to show they could do things beyond simply domestic chores and tasks in the South. In fact, even with the McCormick Reaper, on many of the northern farms during this time period, agricultural productivity did not decrease. It actually increased because women were able to manage the reapers and continue farming in the plains areas, even though so many of their men were off at war. The biggest element, though, might be for the future political consequences of Southern departure. By leaving the Union and leaving Congress, lots of laws that Northerners would have wanted to get passed, that they were constantly frustrated, not able to get passed, they were able to pass. And so the Homestead Act, which set up land grants for individual small farmers, homestead plots, not plantations, homestead plots, that gets passed during the Civil War. The Morrill Land Grant Act, which sets up state university systems in many of the states from essentially the Mississippi-Ohio River Basin westward, the flagship campuses you would know, that gets set up during this time, passed by a Republican-dominated Congress. A moral tariff, a tax on imports. Remember 1828, the Tariff of Abominations that the South hated so much? Well, in 1833, there's a compromise tariff put in. We talked about that. With the South gone from government, the North can pass a tariff that's as high as it wants on imported goods coming in, which protects its own home domestic industries, and it proceeds to do so. And the last of these big things is a transcontinental railroad. And it should come as no surprise to you which route that railroad follows. They don't follow the southern route from New Orleans through the Gadsden Purchase territory to Los Angeles. They follow Stephen Douglas's route from Chicago through Omaha, all the way through the Kansas-Nebraska territories, all the way to San Francisco. So the railroad follows a northern route, and in many ways, we'll see the shaping and dictating of the Union from here out based upon this Hamiltonian industrial diversified economy state, because the North temporarily had the votes, and by winning the war, the North will kind of continue to have those votes in the short term afterwards to shape the Union as it sees fit to sort of remake the entire national Union in its own image. Southern domestic issues, we've hit upon some of this already. There were severe economic limitations for the South with a one-dimensional economy, and also institutional and political limitations. The central government of the South tried to become stronger in order to wage the war, which is ironic because the South was rebelling against what it saw as being a government that was too strong. And so the South, in many ways, you could argue, it died of an idea, died of a theory, and that theory was states' rights. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, would have killed. He would have killed to have had the kind of federal authority that Lincoln did, to call out volunteer militias, to nationalize them in the federal army, to suspend habeas corpus, to jail as dissidents, to put the nation on an economic war footing. The state governors, in many ways, didn't give him that power. And so the theory the South died of was states' rights. And a really great example of this is, even in the last months of the war, the governor of North Carolina, Zebulon Vance, he was hoarding in the state government, he was hoarding like 92,000 Confederate Army uniforms. This is like in the last months of the war. And he said he wasn't giving them out because, yes, they were Confederate Army uniforms, but they were for North Carolina soldiers. They weren't for everyone else. And so the South could not get over this states' rights theory, and it wound up destroying them, because if they were going to survive against the weight of a combined Union, even with the Copperhead anti-war faction, they were going to unify to a degree that they could not assemble and put together politically, let alone economically with their limitations. So their diplomatic limitations, obviously, they were unable to get England and France to join into this conflict because realpolitik, the British and French weren't going to join in unless it looked like the South had a chance to win. After Antietam and definitely after Gettysburg, the South doesn't look like it's going to have the opportunity to actually win this conflict. And they don't, and so that seals the fate in many ways of the South. Now, the South had no established political party system, which the North did, so there was no loyalties that could be established to that political party system or that government. The number one loyalty of most Southerners was to their own state, much to their detriment. They had a lack of food, clothes, troops, allies, nothing that I'm sure that's been belabored at length in your history courses, so we can move beyond that. Moving to the uncertain future, I guess. The war does bring out two major elements. The whole notion of states' rights, national supremacy, that debate is over. National union is now a fact. And the old line for this historians use is, before the war, people said the United States are. After the war, people said the United States is. With the are, the emphasis is on the states. With the is, the emphasis is on the united half of that clause. The United States is, it's one body. Economic growth in the Hamiltonian style, state of the future is now kind of guaranteed and prepared for. And check out on your final slide these big questions in this uncertain future. The big questions of our current lesson and the lesson just before it was these issues of states' rights and national supremacy. Was this truly a war or an internal struggle or rebellion, or is it a war between two independent nations? And what was the big cause? Was this a war over whether or not nullification was legal, or was this a war of human liberation? Our next lesson, setting the stage for the real big problems. We said wars don't always solve old problems, sometimes they create new ones. Notice your next questions. Great, we've gotten rid of slavery. What do you do with 4.5 million people who have no education, no assets, no finances, limited skills, and they're in a nation where a whole lot of their neighbors who are white really don't like them? What do you do with that? How do you duct tape this country back together again? What should the winners do with the South? Are they all guilty of treason? What should become of them? How do you bind these wounds back up? And last of all, of course, winning the war versus winning the peace. In some ways, the combat is easy. The enemy's there, go get them. Winning a peace, winning hearts and minds, that's going to be a far more rigorous struggle. And that's the story of our next lesson, that far more rigorous struggle.